The weight of silence there is a kind of silence that exists only in the space between stars, a silence so complete that it has texture, so complete that it presses against the hull of a ship like a hand testing the strength of a door. The Kesarine Compact had catalogued 4,712 varieties of silence in their long history of crossing the dark, and they believed, with the calm certainty of a species that had never been wrong about something this large, that they understood every one of them. They had never met a human. The research vessel Anjuv had been drifting at the edge of the Thessaly drift for 11 cycles when its sensors first caught the signal. Not a transmission, not a beacon, but a heat signature, small, steady, and utterly impossible in a debris field that had been declared dead for 600 years. Commander Ithel Sorn stood over the display and watched the thermal bloom pulse like something breathing, and she felt the particular unease that comes from finding a heartbeat in a graveyard. "Confirm the reading," she said. Her science officer, a Velithi named Daskar whose 4 eyes moved independently across the data, confirmed it 3 times before he was willing to say the words aloud. "It's a structure, Commander, sealed, pressurized. And it has been here." He paused, recalculating, certain he had made an error, recalculating again. "It has been here for approximately 430 years. Thessaly Drift was not a place things survived. It was the wreckage of a war fought so long ago that even its cause had crumbled into myth, a field of shattered hulls and dead engines stretching across 11 light-years, seeded with mines that had long since lost their allegiance and would detonate for anyone. The compact avoided it. Everyone avoided it. It was, by every metric the galaxy agreed upon, a tomb. And in the middle of that tomb something was still warm. Sorn authorized the approach herself. She had spent 30 years in service to the compact, had seen derelicts and ghost ships and the slow architecture of extinction in a dozen systems, and none of it had prepared her for what the Anjuv's lights revealed as they closed the distance. The structure was small, barely the size of a shuttle, built from scavenged plating that did not match any single vessel, welded together with a stubbornness that looked less like engineering and more like refusal. Refusal to stop. Refusal to die. Refusal, 430 years running, to let the dark win. "Life signs," Daskar said, and this time his voice had lost its scientific detachment entirely. "Commander, there are life signs. They cut an airlock seal with more care than they had ever exercised in their lives, because whatever had built that shelter had built it to keep something out, and the last thing any of them wanted was to be mistaken for the thing it had been built against." The inner door hissed open into a chamber lit by a single failing bulb, and the air that rolled out smelled of rust and recycled breath and something else, something none of the crew had a word for because their species did not produce it. The smell of a living thing that has been alone for longer than any living thing should be. In the corner, wrapped in a blanket stitched from a dozen different fabrics, sat a boy. He could not have been older than 15 by human reckoning. Though none of them knew that yet, none of them had ever seen a human before, had only heard the old stories, half history, half warning, about a species that had burned through its own solar system in a war so total that the survivors had scattered like sparks and never regathered. The Compact's archives called them the Vanished. They had assumed, as a matter of quiet consensus, that the name was accurate. The boy did not flinch when the lights hit him. He looked up slowly, the way someone looks up who has trained themselves not to hope, because hope in a place like this was a debt you paid for in the coin of your own composure. His eyes were the color of the void outside, flat and gray and old in a way his face was not, and when he spoke his voice was rough from disuse but perfectly steady. "Not supposed to be here," he said. "Nobody's supposed to be here." Sorn knelt at the threshold, keeping her hands visible, keeping her voice low the way she would for any wounded thing. "We detected your heat signature. We came to help. Help." The boy repeated the word like it was a language he'd forgotten how to speak, then quietly, almost to himself, "Took you 400 years. They learned his name was Elias only because it was carved into the wall beside 100 other names, a long column of them scratched into the metal with something sharp, each one followed by a date, each one ending. He would not tell them who the names belonged to. He did not have to. The crew of the Anjuv had seen enough death in their travels to recognize a memorial when they stood inside one. It took 3 cycles to earn enough of his trust for him to tell the story, and even then he told it the way you tell something you've rehearsed alone in the dark so many times that the words have worn smooth like river stones. He was 6 when the convoy his family had been part of, refugees he called them, though the word meant something different to the crew than it did to him, was ambushed in the drift by a faction the Compact had never heard of, a splinter group still fighting a war that the rest of the galaxy considered ancient history. The convoy had been running. It had not run fast enough. His parents had put him in the shelter pod with what supplies they could gather and sealed it with their own hands, and the last thing his mother had said to him, through a comm channel already dying, was that she would come back for him. He believed her for the first 2 years. He believed her in some quiet, unkillable corner of himself for all 400. Pod wasn't built to last, he said on the third night, sitting across from Sorn in the mess hall with a bowl of food he had not yet touched, as though eating it would mean admitting he trusted them not to be another ending. Water reclaimer failed after 60 years. I fixed it with parts from 3 different wrecks. The air scrubber's third redesign, I lost count of how many times I rebuilt it. Everything in that shelter has been broken and rebuilt so many times it isn't the thing it started as anymore. Neither am I, probably. Daskar, who had spent his career studying the resilience thresholds of a dozen species, ran the numbers privately that night and did not sleep afterward. A Velithi in that shelter, by every model his people had ever built, would have died of despair within a decade even if the equipment had held. Not from lack of oxygen, from lack of reason. His species required a plausible future to keep functioning. Strip that away and the mind followed the body into stillness. Gently, like a machine powering down. It was not a flaw. It was simply how a mind that evolved in safety was built. Elias had had no plausible future. He had built one anyway out of scavenged plating and stubbornness, and a mother's promise he had known for 390 years was almost certainly a lie he was choosing to believe. Why? Daskar finally asked him, unable to hold the question in any longer. You must have understood eventually that the probability of rescue was. I know what the probability was. Elias didn't look up from the panel he was tinkering with. He had already within a week made himself useful to the ship's engineering deck, unable to sit still, unable to trust a repair he hadn't made with his own hands. I did the math when I was 9. I did it again every year after that, and it got worse every time. Didn't matter. Not. Elias set down his tools. For a moment the old flatness came back into his eyes, the 400-year-old thing looking out from a 15-year-old face. Because the math isn't the point. The math tells you what's likely. It doesn't tell you what you're allowed to want. He picked the tools back up. My mom said she'd come back. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe none of them made it out. I'll never know, probably. But I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to let the universe's math decide what I believed on her behalf. She said come back, so I stayed ready. That's it. That's the whole reason. Daskar had no framework for this. His species cataloged outcomes and adjusted expectations accordingly. Hope to the Velithi was a probability estimate, useful only insofar as it was accurate. What Elias described was not an estimate. It was a decision renewed daily in defiance of every estimate available to him. It should not have been sustainable. No model the Compact possessed could account for 400 years of a 15-year-old boy's stubbornness, holding a shelter together through sheer refusal to let a memorial become a grave. Word of him spread through the Compact faster than Sorn could control, and not everyone who came to see him came with kindness. There were scholars who wanted to study him like a specimen, officials who wanted to debrief him like an intelligence asset, and at least one delegation that arrived with barely disguised nervousness, because the stories about humanity's war had never fully faded, and a surviving human, however young, however alone, was a reminder that the species the galaxy had quietly filed under extinct might not be as gone as everyone had hoped. Elias met all of them the same way, politely, warily, and with a directness that unsettled people who had spent their careers speaking in careful diplomatic layers. When a Compact ethicist asked him with clinical delicacy, Whether he understood that his survival strategy had been statistically irrational, Elias had looked at her for a long moment and said, "You've never had to survive anything, have you?" It was not an insult. It was an observation, delivered flat, and the ethicist had no answer for it because she hadn't. The turning point, the moment the story of Elias stopped being a curiosity and became something the compact would speak of for generations, came on the ninth cycle, when the Anjuv sensors picked up a second heat signature in the drift, 40 kilometers from where Elias had been found. Smaller, fainter. Failing, Soren brought the news to him carefully, the way you carry something that might break in your hands. "It could be nothing," she said. "Equipment, a false read." Elias was already moving before she finished the sentence. "It's not nothing, nothing doesn't have a heartbeat." They took a shuttle out together, Elias insisted, and no one on that crew, having watched him rebuild a scrubber system 3 separate times over 4 centuries, had the will or the right to tell a survivor of the drift that he didn't understand the risks of the drift better than they did. The second shelter was smaller than his had been, more primitive, built by hands that hadn't had 400 years to refine the craft. Inside, they found a woman, human, elderly by the medical scans estimate, though it was hard to be certain given how long she had likely gone without proper nutrition, unconscious but alive, her vitals thin as thread. Elias knelt beside her in the wreckage of a shelter that was not his own, and for the first time since the Anjuv had found him, the crew watched the void flat calm in his eyes crack open into something raw. "I don't know her," he said when Soren asked, his voice unsteady in a way it hadn't been in 9 full cycles of rescue and interrogation and careful, guarded politeness. She's not my mother, I don't know her." He looked up and there were 400 years of a question in his face that he had never let himself ask out loud. "But she's one of us, she's human, she's been out here too. All this time there were others and nobody came," and he stopped, started again quieter. "I always figured I was the only one left in the whole drift, the only one still holding on. I wasn't. There were 2 of us the whole time and neither of us knew." Woman survived. Her name, they would learn once she woke, was Renata, and she had been part of a different convoy entirely, scattered by the same ancient, forgotten war 40 years after Elias' family had been lost, drifting through the same graveyard without ever knowing another survivor breathed within it. She had been 12 when her shelter sealed. She was by the ship's best estimate past her 60th year now, and the arithmetic of that, a lifetime spent almost entirely inside a box built to keep death out, was not lost on anyone standing in that medical bay. When she opened her eyes for the first time and saw Elias sitting beside her bed, the first thing she said in a voice cracked from 40 years of talking mostly to herself was, "Are you real or am I finally done?" "Real," Elias told her. "You're not done." "Neither am I." It was Doskar in the end who put into words what the entire crew of the Anjuv had come to understand but had not yet found language for. He requested to address the Compact's Research Council directly, an unusual step for a science officer of his rank, and when he stood before them his 4 eyes did something Velithi eyes rarely did in formal proceedings. They moved to stillness, all 4 fixed on the same point, the posture his species reserved for grief and for awe in equal measure. "We have spent generations," he told the council, "cataloging the resilience of species across this galaxy, and we built our models on a simple premise, that hope requires a reasonable foundation, that a mind will sustain belief only as long as belief is supported by evidence. By every framework we possess, the boy in that shelter should have stopped believing in rescue within a decade. He should have stopped being anything at all, should have simply gone still, the way our own people go still when the evidence runs out. Instead, he rebuilt a life support system by hand alone for 400 years, on the strength of 6 words spoken by a woman who may not have survived the hour after she spoke them. And when we found a second survivor, a woman he owed nothing to, a stranger in every sense, his first instinct was not relief that he was no longer alone. It was grief that he hadn't found her 400 years sooner. That is not a resilience threshold. I do not have a model for what that is. I am not certain we should build one. Some things perhaps are not meant to be reduced to a probability curve. Perhaps they are meant only to be witnessed." The council had no response prepared for that. Neither for a long time did the rest of the galaxy. The compact eventually did what compacts do. They opened a formal inquiry into the fate of the human diaspora, dispatched search vessels to a dozen other drift fields and dead zones where old wars had once scattered the vanished, operating now on a hypothesis they would not have entertained a year earlier, that a species capable of what Elias had done might have left more than wreckage behind. In the 18 months that followed, they found 11 more shelters. 7 held survivors. 4 held only names carved into metal, and dates and silence. Elias visited every rescue in person when the compact would allow it, and when they found the shelters that held only names, he stood in front of each one for a long time, reading them aloud one by one, as though a name spoken by a living voice mattered more than a name carved into a wall, as though it was the last thing he could do for people he had never met, who had done exactly what he had done for exactly as long, and simply run out of time before anyone came. Renata, once her strength returned, took to calling him the boy who wouldn't let the dark win, though by the time the compact's rescues were finished sweeping the old battlefields, that title belonged as much to her and to every survivor pulled from the wreckage of a war none of them had started and none of them had chosen. When a young compact journalist finally asked Elias on a broadcast that would eventually be seen across a dozen systems, what had kept him going when the odds against him had been, by any calculation, absurd, he gave the answer he had already given 100 times in 100 smaller rooms to people who had never quite believed it could be that simple. People keep asking me for the trick, he said. Like there was a technique, there wasn't. I just decided when I was 6 years old that I wasn't going to be the reason my mother's promise came true or didn't. I was going to be ready either way. That's not bravery. That's not even hope, not really hope supposed to feel good, and half the time this didn't feel like anything at all. It just felt like getting up and fixing the scrubber one more time because the alternative was letting it break. I think people mix up hope with comfort. They're not the same thing. Comfort is easy to lose. I never had a shred of it out there, not for 400 years. But I never stopped choosing to keep going, and eventually I realized that choosing it enough times in a row is its own kind of promise, one you make to yourself when nobody else is left to make it to you. He paused, and for a moment the void-gray stillness returned to his eyes, not flat this time, but something closer to peace. My mother told me she'd come back. Maybe she meant to and couldn't. Maybe she never got the chance to try. I'll spend the rest of my life not knowing, and I've made peace with that, because here's the thing nobody tells you about a promise like that. It doesn't actually matter in the end whether the person keeps it. What matters is what you decide to build out of believing they might. I built 400 years out of 6 words. I'd do it again. I'd do it 1,000 times if that's what it took, because the day I stop is the day the dark finally gets what it's been waiting for. And I decided a long time ago that it wasn't getting anything from me, not while I still had breath to spend refusing it. Silence in the broadcast studio afterward was, several present would later say, unlike any silence the compact had ever recorded. Not empty, not the dead, textureless silence of the drift, pressing against a hull, patient and endless and indifferent. This silence had weight. It was the silence of a species that had spent generations believing they understood the shape of endurance, discovering all at once that they had never truly seen it. Not until a boy who had rebuilt his own reason to live piece by scavenged piece for 400 years in the wreckage of a war that wasn't his to survive, had simply looked into a camera and told them the truth as plainly as he knew how. That hope was never about the odds. It was about who you chose to become while you waited for them to change. Somewhere in the Thessaly drift, the shelter he'd built still floated, its lights dark now, its scrubber finally, mercifully still. The compact had voted to leave it exactly as it was, not salvaged, not studied, not disturbed, a monument to a promise no one could prove was ever meant to be kept, and to a boy who had decided 400 years before anyone came looking that some things are worth building anyway.